A growing number of increasingly young children are suffering from some form of mental health issue. On World Mental Health Day, the children's charity Place to Be says that almost 3/4 of those it counsels show signs of anxiety, while over half are depressed or withdrawn. In the latest of our No Go Britain series, our reporter is Jess Naisbitt, who hit crisis point while at primary school when she was just 10. She tells us how she fought her way back to health and explores the everyday worries that are getting children down.
This news story is striking because they're discussing a very serious problem, a problem which is becoming increasingly worse as time goes by, but no one suggests or seems to realize that there is a much bigger problem which is causing the symptomatic problem. The presenter talks about coping with everyday problems, but it's never raised by anybody that the solution needs to be to change the world rather than to help children cope with the way the world is becoming. Nobody suggests that we need to prevent the world becoming worse and worse and more stressful, which will then in turn cause more and more children to be depressed. The education system forces stress and competition on children at a very young age, and this system is churning out adults which are creating the world we live in, right? The adults who are currently in the world, and it's a world which is competitive and stressful. So next, listen to the girl and the teacher talk about the problem of childhood depression, and notice that almost all of the problems they talk about are found in school.
I'm 14 now, but I was 10 years old and still at primary school when I hit crisis point. Walking to school I used to go dead slow because what if I get picked on, what if none of my friends are there, what if I'm on my own all day? So all the thoughts used to just roll on in just like a minute, and I used to think of all the worst situations. If a teacher asked me a question, like my heart would go like dead fluttery, and like my hands would start to sweat and I'd start to go bright red, and like I couldn't say anything. I was just like stuck, like freaking out.
I think we've noticed in the last 5 years mainly, but probably 10 years before that, there's been a bit of decline in children's mental health or well-being. More so children falling into depression really early, anxiety about exams, about academic, about family matters. We've seen behaviour disruption disorders, more ADHD that is coming in, but children that tend to just be more aware of what's happening in the world and very unhappy, and they're coming into school with all these things behind them and having to just be children.
So the girl's story begins with, quote unquote, walking to school. Okay, that's where all the problems began for her. All of the stresses she describes were at school. And then the head teacher also describes the stresses children have at school. And she mentions the awareness of children of how stressful the world is. Okay, so both the girl and the head teacher have agreed that the problem is the stresses in school, the stresses of the education system, and the stresses of the way the world is. Okay, now we go back to the studio and we listen to the expert in the field, Dr. Fiona Pienaar.
So, Dr. Pienaar, how have we ended up in this situation where so many young people, children, are now experiencing these mental health issues?
I think it's a far more stressful world than we live in, even 5-10 years ago. There's a lot of pressure on children and young people around academics. We have young children worrying about what they're going to be and what they're going to do when they grow up. I think it's a much faster paced world, and they see their parents and their teachers very busy. And then, of course, there's the online environment as well, which can be 24/7 for you.
So, like the head teacher and the girl who suffered depression, Dr. Pienaar also describes the stresses children face at school and in the wider world. So we have a consensus between the child, the teacher, and the expert that the problem is the stresses in the world, mostly from school, and also the stresses from the wider world perhaps due to information technology or the internet. Okay, so this is the problem. Stresses in school, stresses in the world. It's a stressful competitive school, stressful competitive world. This is the problem. So what solutions does Dr. Piena put forward? Does she discuss alternatives to the education system which are not stressful or competitive for children? Does she heck?
Well, I think it's a range of approaches, really. We'd like to see teachers having more training around recognising signs, whether that's a young person withdraws or is more aggressive or more boisterous, just that they can recognise those signs that there's a change happening.
Is this about a cut in services? Is it a question of funding?
Well, I think my organisation, Place to Be, we've spoken out before and said we think government needs to invest more in training of teachers, more in mental health services for children and young people, and that means statutory services, so the more specialised services, as well as early intervention. So having a professional in each school would be the best.
So there you have the expert. She mentions a range of approaches. That's what she says, a range of approaches. But in fact, she only actually offers two solutions. One, the training of teachers so they can spot the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. The training of teachers to be able to spot the problem and intervene. And tax-funded allocation of a child psychology expert to every school for early intervention. Okay, to help the child deal with the problem once the problem is already there. Right? It doesn't solve it. It's just dealing with the problem. It's helping children to cope with the problem. It doesn't deal with the problem, which is a stressful competitive education system, which is producing a stressful competitive education system. The problem is the education system. You can't solve the problem through the education system. The education system is the problem. I know it. They all know it, but no one will say it.
It's bigger than you are not me. The links that I will go to, the distance